I believe that's what Paul and Silas did to God. God is saying, you mean, guys, after everything you have been through for me, you are still worshiping me and praising me at midnight? And something amazing happened. In verse 26, something incredible happened. It says this, suddenly. Everyone say suddenly. There was such a violent earthquake that the foundation of the prison were shaken. At once, all the prison doors flew open and everyone's chains came loose. Wow. What happened? Their worship caused an earthquake. Their worship caused God to show up. And the interesting thing happened was everyone's chains came loose. Now what happened here? Why did everyone's chains come loose? Because they were in prison with two guys who decided, in spite of their circumstances, they were going to worship God at midnight. Now, the opposite can also be true. In Jonah chapter 1, we find an interesting story. The sailors almost lost their lives. Why? Because Jonah was on their ship. Notice the storm did not subside until they had thrown Jonah overboard. After they got rid of Jonah, the sea got calm. The question you have to answer this morning is, who do you have in your life that could be creating some storms? You know, when I talk to young people, I make this point very clear. Sometimes you need to get rid of certain people. Sometimes you need to cut ties. You know, my barber has been to prison. And my barber said to me one day, Huntley, one day I got up in prison and I looked around me and I said, I am not one of these guys. This is not who I am. And that realization changed his life. He got out, he got married, beautiful family, and now he's running a successful barbershop. Why? Because he knew he had to cut ties with certain friends that were bringing him down. Sometimes we have to do the same. We have to make sure we know who's in our lives. The sailors had Jonah on their ship, and that almost cost them their lives. In Genesis chapter 41, we find another interesting story. An entire nation was saved. Why? Because Joseph, the man of God, was in Egypt. And he had the deliverance of a nation wrapped up inside him, even though he was in prison. And God spoke to Pharaoh in a dream. But Pharaoh could not interpret the dream. It took Joseph, the man of God, to walk into Pharaoh's presence and to interpret the dream for Pharaoh. Why was Egypt saved? Because Joseph was there. Why did the sailors almost drown? Because Jonah was on the ship. Why did everyone's chains come loose? Because Paul and Silas were in the prison, worshiping God at midnight. So the point is, you can be blessed by association and you can be cursed by association. The story continues. Acts 16, verse 27. Acts 16, verse 27 says this. The jailer woke up, and when he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself. We are all here." So the jailer knew if the prisoners had escaped under his watch, he would have been killed. Paul knew this too, and Paul said, "Don't harm yourself. We are all here." The jailer called for lights and rushed in and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. He then asked a very interesting question in verse 30. He said this, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" What kind kind of a question is this? You are in the midst of a natural disaster, and you are asking, what must I do to be saved? You see, the jailer knew this was not a normal earthquake. He knew it was not a normal earthquake. The men on the boat with Jonah knew this was not a normal storm. In David's time, there was a famine, and David knew this was not a normal famine. So he asked God a question. Listen to the question that happened with David. 2 Samuel 21 verse 1 says this. During the reign of David, there was a famine for 3 successive years. So David sought the face of the Lord. The Lord said, it is on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. It is because he put the Gibeonites to death. This is interesting. There was a famine. And David is saying, this is not a normal famine. God, what's the reason for this famine? God said, it's because of Saul. The men on the ship with Jonah, when they saw the storm, they said, let us cast lots to find out who. Think about it for a second. They're saying, who is responsible? What kind of a question is that in the midst of a natural disaster? They're asking who? But their hunch was right. And the same thing happened with the jailer. He knew this was not a normal earthquake. So he asked the question, what must I do to be saved? And Paul said, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you shall be saved. Why did the jailer ask that question? He asked the question because he had 2 guys in prison who decided they are going to worship God in the morning. They're going to worship God in the afternoon. They're going to worship God in the evening. They're worshiping God when you talk bad about them. They're worshiping God when they have been beaten, when they have been thrown into jail in spite of their circumstances. They were going to worship God. You need to do the same if you want a spirit of discernment. You're going to say, God, I am going to worship you even when I don't feel like worshiping you.